All right, we're ready now. Well, good morning and welcome. We're going to have our second seminar on the big picture of the Bible. These are 4 video conferences that we're doing. We did the first one back in August, and it's recorded. And if you didn't get to hear it, you can do it. But these are a chronological presentation of the 10 major periods of the Hebrew and Christian history. It's a guidebook to Bible study. I think it really helps us go through that. I think all of you are muted now, and I'm going to move us on. There's a booklet. If you haven't got it yet, there's a booklet that contains the contents of this series. I think you have a digital copy that I sent you, but there are plenty of printed copies at the worship place, and you can just go there to the welcome desk and you can get those. At the end of the seminar, you're welcome to unmute your mic so that you can make comments or ask questions. We will record this seminar. It's being recorded right now, and it'll be posted on our website next week. All 4 of them can be viewed by accessing the website under archive recordings. Let me just take a minute to show you this timeline again. It's in the book and it's in your brochure. But if you look at those 2 red dots on the upper left-hand corner, that's the period that we covered in the first seminar. The second seminar starts in the second red dot and goes all the way to that third one, which is on the lower side. And that's the one we'll be doing today. And so Bill will be discussing that a lot more. I'm going to introduce him again. I think many of you have heard me introduce him before, but Bill Pitts is a emeritus professor at Baylor University. Bill, I noticed that they just opened up the Tidwell Bible building again. Maybe you got an office back. I don't know.
No, I'll leave that to some other people.
I think that's a good idea. You got to stay retired. But Bill is an internationally known scholar and writer and speaker on church history. He's done a lot. He's retired, but he's still editing and writing a lot of material. One of the best assets of Bill is he's married to a wonderful woman named Ruth Pitts. She's an incredible pianist and teacher. She hasn't taught me piano yet, but she's good. They've got 2 sons and 4 grandchildren, and they've been dear friends of ours for many, many years. We grew up together and worshiped in our church together. And 30 years ago, Bill conducted this seminar on the 10 major periods. He did it live, and it was well attended, and over 300 copies of that printed notes were distributed during that year. And so it's been very popular again this year. And earlier this year, Bill presented a series of seminars on the history of Christianity, and those are recorded. It can also be found. So, Bill, I'm going to turn this over to you and let you kind of introduce this seminar too, and I'll keep the slides moving for you.
Importance of the 10 Commandments. So today we will deal with the question of the conquest of the land, the people who were responsible for that, for leading that. Then we go to an important change in the sense that the Hebrew people adopt a monarch, a king, a ruler. And they have those rulers, 3 of them together are ruling over all 12 tribes. And so that's called the United Monarchy. And then there's a division in the kingdom, north and south. And so you have to kind of track 2 separate stories, the story of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And during that period of time is when the Hebrew prophets flourish best and most. And those are some of the most compelling ideas that we have from the Old Testament that we still find in Christianity, because we've adopted a good bit of that. All right. Now, if we move on down to our next slide.
Well, a second, I'm trying to.
There we go. Good. So just a moment with the map. This is a very, very useful map for us. On the far left, you can see Goshen. That was the part of Egypt where the Hebrew people lived during the time of the captivity, or the time while they were there in Goshen. Then, as you find in the book of Numbers, especially, they go down to Sinai. So you follow the red line to the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula, and Mount Sinai is believed to be somewhere in that vicinity, or perhaps elsewhere. We don't really know for sure. But we do know that there's a lot of reference to these people living in the region of Kadesh Barnea during the wilderness time. So this 40-year period of wilderness life apparently is just south of Israel. You can see then the Dead Sea is the body of water there. Oh, it's actually marked. It's named for us there. The Jordan River, and then the Sea of Galilee just above it. Now, notice the red marker for the route for the way these people went in. They tried to go in straight from the south and found too much opposition. So they wandered over toward Edom, and they wanted to go through Edom, but the Edomites wouldn't let them come in. And so they had to go all the way to the south and circuit Edom and Moab, go around those two little countries and come in just north of Moab and south of Ammon. So the entry into the land of Canaan, the promised land, is going to be from east into the west. Now, it's important to see Edom and Moab are here, but they were not established as kingdoms before 1300. Archaeology has shown us that. So that helps us date the time of the Exodus. Now, in Israel itself, you can see Hebron, Jericho. Canaan is the name, the earliest name there, because of the residents, the Canaanites. And if you look at that, if we were to cut that and slice it like a geologist might want to look at the terrain or the topography of this country, out by the Mediterranean Sea, it's going to be very flat. And then it rises into what is called the hill country. And that's where most of the Hebrew people will live. The villages, the cities, and so forth will be occupied in that area by these Hebrew people coming in. Then the Jordan means another rift or a valley that goes far down into the depths of, there we go. We got it marked out for us. Good. Dead Sea is considered to be the lowest point on the face of the earth at, I think, over 1,200 feet below sea level. But if you follow the Jordan River and all the way down to the Gulf of Aqaba, you would see a kind of a declivity there. Now, on the right side of the Jordan River, you have, it's flat, but it's elevated. So you have a kind of a step situation there. And you will have, from the point of entry and to the north, the Hebrew people will occupy two and a half tribes will live in that area, but most of them are going to go into Canaan itself. So the conquest that we're talking about now, as you can see here, is dated for a 200-year period, 1220 down to 1020 BCE. All right, let's move on. Conquest and the judges. So the conquest, that word simply means a successful struggle for land. And so these people are going to occupy this area in some way. And it was known as the land that flows with milk and honey. So this is an endearing way to speak of this land in the Old Testament. The date of the conquest is about 1250, as best we can tell these days. This Merneptah stela, Merneptah was a pharaoh. You can see these images at the top of this stone. And then the writing in here is a hieroglyphics. Well, hieroglyphics are all over Egypt. That was an early form of writing. It's a picture writing, and people did not know how to read that or what it meant until the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, which is a stone that carries the same message in three languages. So they're parallel. And so this Rosetta Stone, which is probably the best known treasure in the British Museum, it attracts hundreds every day, had on it the hieroglyphics, a late Egyptian form called Demotic, and Greek. Well, a young Frenchman at about 1820, early 20s of the 19th century was able to crack the code because he took the Rosetta Stone and he compared these two, especially proper names. And there was a lot of guesswork here, but it worked. And so he was able to figure out how hieroglyphics worked and sort of gave us the key to unlock all of this information that we have that is well preserved in Egypt. So the Merneptah stela is the very first. The stela, it means an inscribed stone. And so at the very bottom of this document, or this stone, I should say, is the first reference to Israel that we have outside the Old Testament. And so it talks about the Pharaoh and his relationship to Israel. Now, Edom and Moab have been dug carefully by the archaeologists, and they don't find any evidence of permanent settlement before 1300. Well, they stopped the Israelites coming in, so we know that the Israelites are coming in after 1300. Now, the archaeology of the various sites that were conquered and some that weren't conquered and so forth gives some evidence of destruction, fairly wide destruction in this 13th century, in the 1200s. So that may be evidence also of these folks coming in, such as at Lachish and Hazor. One of the troubling things about this part of the Bible for people today is the idea of a holy war, or the Cherem, as it was called, which is the idea of devoting everything there to Yahweh, to God, and therefore the command to destroy everything. And that's just not the way the Geneva Convention and so forth, our understanding of how we conduct wars these days. So, but this was the practice not only in this culture, but in many other cultures as well. All right, let's move on. So here's another map with the players now in this story. You can see that you have Kadesh Barnea down at the far corner of the left lower area. Yeah, so we need to get them coming in just north of the Dead Sea. So you have Edom to the right, Moab above it, and Ammon. Those are three constant foes for the Israelites. On the other side over here is Philistia, on the other side of Judah and on the Mediterranean. And that was the most difficult of all the foes that they had. Now, as they move in, and as we divide later, you'll see Judah in the south and Israel in the north. Those are the two main divisions of Israel during the divided kingdom. Their trading partner up in the north is Phoenicia. You can see Phoenicia on the map there, and they were particularly good at craftsmanship, and they did a lot to help build the temple because they understood how to do that. And they had the cedars of Lebanon as well. And then Aram, and that's modern Syria, and we'll have contact with them. And then further off to the northeast will be three groups of people who will come and invade this area. First the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians, and then the Persians. And all of those are going to have some play into the story. In part because those folks would all like to go through this land and control Egypt, or as close to Egypt as they can come. All right, let's move on. So the age of the judges is this period I've indicated. And one of the reasons that they're able to create all these little countries we've just seen, Moab and Ammon and so forth, as well as Israel, is because the big players, the big empires were, excuse me, were weak. That includes Egypt and the Hittite Empire in what is today Turkey. And so these small kingdoms emerge: Moab, Edom, Edom, and Phoenicia. But above all, we think of Philistia. Excuse me. And they came in just a few years after the Israelites were settled. The Philistines were organized around 5 cities. They understood how to use iron, and this gave them a military advantage. And this is where we begin the Iron Age. It was bronze before this, and now these weapons will be made with iron beginning about 1200. And they lived, sorry, I missed this. That should be the plain of Philistia rather than Phoenicia. So as the kids say these days, my bad, but that's just a little error. All right, let's move on. Okay, conquest and the judges. You see Israel there. You see Egypt, where they've come from. Turkey is to the north, and you will see over and over again in the Old Testament, there's a list of peoples who occupy Canaan. And they'll talk about Canaanites and then almost always say Hittites next. So you have a lot of people coming from there. And you will perhaps remember that Bathsheba's husband was a mercenary soldier from, he was Uriah the Hittite. Then over here, you see Assyria in the green. And that is the source of a huge empire that is ruled by different peoples as they struggle with one another. That's the Tigris-Euphrates Valley right there. And you have the Assyrians in there, and then they're defeated by the Babylonians. And then the Babylonians are defeated by the Persians, and they will spread. They're all interested in conquest and in moving as far as they can, both east and west. So they're going to, Israel is often likened to a political football. So they just back and forth. Sometimes they're ruled by the Egyptians, sometimes by somebody from Mesopotamia, these countries between the 2 rivers, Mesopotamia. So that's the Canaanite, the Canaanite political situation in all of this is what we call a city-state. This was like the Greeks. Maybe you've read or had some Greek history. So you'll have Athens and you'll have Sparta, and they will control the area just around them. But there's no sense of a unity of a group of people in a state or a nation. All right, let's move on. We have the nature of the conquest is debated because the evidence shows up differently in the Bible. The Joshua has an assault, just a rapid assault into the land, whereas Judges indicates, well, there's still a lot of cities we haven't taken and a lot of cities we'd never take. And so it's kind of gradual and kind of we live among the Canaanites is the picture you get in Judges. And then there's a modern theory that it's a kind of a social revolution. You have more biblical support for the first 2. Let's move on. The central campaign, if you followed Joshua, it's pretty easy to follow. Chapters 6 through 9 are going to take us through Jericho, which is given over to them miraculously through the power of God. Jericho, sorry about that. So they have this big success, and then they move on a few miles away and are defeated by a little village called At-Ai. And why were they defeated? Well, one of the fellows did not devote everything to God. He kept some of it for himself. This was the family of Achan. So they found out who that was, and they killed all the members of this family. So there's this notion of not just individual responsibility, but corporate responsibility in this ancient society. So this is a real downer. This would be like taking your army in and defeating Houston and then losing a couple of days later to Conroe. So it's a big win and then this loss. But what you have to see is the message of the writer is it's from a theological point of view or from a religious point of view. As long as you're keeping the law and staying faithful to it, God will reward you. And if you don't, then punishment comes. Another example is Gibeon. These are people who had heard how powerful these folks were. And so they said, there's no way we can stop them. So we'll just pretend to be from way off. And they showed up and said, we've heard about you and the power of your God and so forth. Would you promise never to kill us? And we'll be subject to you. And so the Israelites said yes. And so the Gibeonites then, just a few miles away, when they were approached in their homeland, they said, you promised not to hurt us, not to give us any trouble. So the Israelites said, okay, we promise that, but you will be subjected. You will be drawers of water and hewers of wood. You'll be slaves or servants or whatever of us. So this shows us a variety of ways in which these people are sort of infiltrating into the central campaign. The southern campaign, Joshua 10, shows us a taking of taking of Hebron and other areas. But it's notable that they did not take these two huge cities, Jerusalem and Gezer. They were too well defended. The walls were too big. And so they just went around them and conquered what they could. Okay, let's move on. The third part of this is the northern campaign. And so you have the central and then a thrust to the south and then one to the north. There at Shechem, there's no conquest, there's no destruction in this city, and yet these people immediately moved in there with their tabernacle, and they brought the ark there. So all their religious center is going to be right here at Shechem. So how do you explain that? Well, modern interpreters believe that there were a large number of Israelites who never left at the time of Joseph. And that then when these people showed up, they welcomed them, and this is where they had their ark and their covenant renewal. Hazor is the last Canaanite city to fall. It was the largest city of the day. Archaeologists reckon it would hold about 40,000 people. And so this sort of completes the conquest according to the book of Joshua. And the whole point of this book is the promise that God made to Abraham is now fulfilled. So you will have a land, you will have people, and you will be a blessing to the world. So here we have in the book of Joshua fulfillment of that promise to the first of the patriarchs. All right. Now, how are these people going to organize themselves? They organize in what we call today an amphictyony, or a tribal confederacy. So they're brought together by their religion. Now, this is a temple. This is of Apollo. So that's a sort of example, I guess, from Greece. And the amphictyony idea comes from Greece because the Greeks early on stayed very, very much local, separate in their politics, but they would come together for certain needs, mutual defense and that sort of thing. So modern scholars will use this term as a way to describe the confederacy of these 12 tribes. All right. Okay. So what are your alternatives coming in? You could become a kingdom. You could select a king like Moab and Ammon and Edom. Those are all kingdoms. Or you could imitate the Canaanites and just set up little city-states, let your city be a state on its own. Or there's this third option, the amphictyony. And that's the way the Israelites went for this 200-year period. So you have a picture there, that's Greek armor, helmets, and so on. But we're borrowing that concept to explain this, what we might call a sort of a confederacy of these 12 tribes. So what is a Amphictyony anyway. And in politics, it's a kind of a league of tribes. But the binding force in this league, the one thing that they hold together is a common religion. So they all look back to Moses. They all look back to a common law, and especially to this idea of God saving them in the Exodus. Now, the leaders in the Amphictyony are called the judges. So that's why we get the next book in the Old Testament is going to describe their activity. Okay. Now, the number 12, there are lots of parallels in the world of that day, and the purpose has been conjectured in a variety of ways, such as a lunar calendar, and each one having responsibility for 1 month of the year for the care of the tabernacle or the temple, and so on. Anyway, here is the geography of the 12 tribes, and over that 200-year period, this will change some. You see the arrow pointing there to Dan, just over further to the left, if you will, Dan. There it is, that little spot. Now, just below that are the Philistines, and the Philistines put so much pressure on them that the Danites moved all the way up to the far north. So it's not fixed. And how are we going to know where these people live anyway? Well, you have to go to all the cities that are and villages that are mentioned in the Bible in order to draw out these lines. Now, the dominant ones, you'll see Judah in the south. You see Judah, there you go. Now come right up, just one up from that. You see Benjamin, that's not a dominant one, but Saul is going to come from there and David from Judah. So it's going to be that tension there. Now come right on up to Ephraim. There's Ephraim. The north is often simply referred to as Ephraim because that's the strongest of the tribes of the north. Move up one more, Dan. That's Manasseh, and you can see that it's the largest, and it goes half the tribe is over on the eastern side of the Jordan River. So the Bible refers to that as the half tribe of Manasseh. All right. Now let's move on from there. Organizational elements. These people had the ark at Gilgal, at Shechem, at Shiloh, and of course the tabernacle covering that as well. But the main point was to know where God is located. And the ark, these people understood to be a kind of a throne on which God rested. So that's the cohesive force in this Amphictyony is the religion. They shared the law, as I said. The ritual of covenant renewal is an assembly that it gathers together at Shechem once a year. You will probably remember from, if you had Bible school, when I did, choose you this day whom you will serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So this is the kind of a call at the end of Joshua to people to make this kind of covenant commitment once every year. You know, we've just gone through the New Year and Atonement Day for the Israelites, or for the modern Hebrews, and or the modern Jewish people. And this kind of a notion of having a Passover in the home once a year, where you're reminded of this event of God saving his people, is a really powerful force, I think, in religion. So the covenant renewal is a time when you can bring in new converts or some of the Canaanites. But they read out the covenant law. If you read Deuteronomy 27:28, cursed be you if you don't do this. This is the 10 Commandments. Cursed be you, cursed. And then echoing from the other side, the other mountain, Mounts Gerizim and Ebal, comes, and blessed are you. You will be blessed by God. You will be given the blessings of God if you do keep the law. So apparently they had this annual covenant renewal in this region as well, hence the importance of Shechem. Now, why did all this Amphictyony collapse? They understood, they thought of the real leader of this whole movement as God. But they have to move to a political leader because the Philistines start defeating them. And the Philistines prove to be more powerful than any one of these tribes individually. Going to have to bring the tribes together and have this kind of coherence in order to succeed politically. All right, let's move on. Now, the Canaanites were a challenge to these people militarily. They were a challenge to them religiously as well, because what we read in the Old Testament is that these folks are forever going off to worship the God of the Canaanites. Now, why would they do that? Well, they're sort of nomads, and they have come in and start to live among these people, and they start to do some farming. And how do you do this? And the farmer explained, then, well, why do you go up to this group of trees and make an offering? Well, you have to do that because this is the way we pay tribute to the God of this land. You know, it rains a certain time of year. Well, the God of the rain is Baal or Baal, and we have to do that. So, and Baal has a consort. He has a female goddess as well, and together they come together in sexual union. How do humans create? Well, it's through this mystery of sexuality, and the result is the miracle of creation. Just as we have the miracle of fertility of the soil and the plants and so forth. So many religions in the ancient world are centered around this idea of the life cycle and guaranteeing that and how that happens. So here are these Hebrew people who worship Yahweh, but they also worship this other god or pay tribute to him. Now, this, of course, infuriates the prophets, but there is a temptation to go in this direction. And this is why idolatry is such a big issue in the Ten Commandments, and why it comes so early on in the Ten Commandments. Don't have any other gods before me. They wouldn't have that rule in there unless they were having that problem. Now, we know a lot more about the religion of the Canaanites because of the Ugaritic text. These were discovered at Ras Shamra, modern Ras Shamra, and they tell us a lot about this religion. All right, let's move on. The gods of Canaan, this fertility religion, were Baal, which is translated Lord or owner. He brings fertility and rain. His symbol is, if we can go back, Dan, the symbol is the bull because of its fertility and because of its strength. And his consort is Asherah, or the fertility goddess. This is a figurine of Asherah, who's the archaeologists found. There are also stone pillars and wooden poles. You can see this woman. The base of this looks sort of like a tree, and then, of course, her large breasts and so forth suggest the fertility. And so, what you have here is the problem is what moderns would call syncretism. That is, you're not worshiping Yahweh alone, but you're worshiping Yahweh and the God of this land. So there's the God of history and the God of the land. And of course, the prophets are going to say, our God is the God of both. All right, let's move on. Now, the judges are these are not the guys who sit in a court to make a distinction about justice, fairness, penalties, punishments, and so forth. But what this is people who are military figures who deliver the Hebrew people from difficult situations. Again, there's our time span. They are the political leaders of what we've just described as the Amphictyony. Okay, let's move on. So a king rules because of inheritance, and until he or she dies, king or queen, rules the whole nation. This is an inherited position. Now look at a judge. This is temporary. I've got to go out and lead my people against a foe and see if we can defeat them. And this may be one tribe or two or three tribes, but almost never all 12 tribes. So how are you going to choose these people? Well, they're people who have a certain gift of leadership. And this is why we use the term charismatic. Charisma simply means a gift. And we talk about charismatic political leaders or military leaders or charismatic figures in society. And that's how these judges are legitimated. All right. So the principal judges, there are 6 of them. We've listed 5 of them here. Ehud versus Eglon of Moab, and then Deborah and Barak against the Canaanites, Gideon against the Midianites, Jephthah against the Ammonites, and Samson against the Philistines. So you know these stories very well. They certainly lend themselves to memory because they are so vivid. Deborah is one of the more influential in the sense that there are 2 accounts of her success against those local Canaanites. The 4th chapter is a narrative, but the 5th is a poem. And a lot of Old Testament scholars believe that is the oldest bit of the Old Testament that we have, that it was written at the time that she had defeated the Canaanites about 1150 BC. So, but what you see here is all these different enemies of these people, of the Israelites, and these folks giving relief from them. So that's what we mean by a judge in this book of the Bible. Of course, Samson is sort of the Hercules of the Hebrew people. Takes his Nazirite vow, has tremendous strength, slays the Philistines, and though he is blinded and so forth, takes his revenge in the temple of the Philistines as he dies. There are 6 more, interestingly enough, 6 more of these that are listed and give us only 2 or 3 verses each. So for some reason, this notion of 12 keeps coming back in. So this is in the mind of the author, the final literary figure who wrote these or who put these accounts together. You have the 12, but only elaborates half of them. So that's the book of Judges. Now, if you look at the book of Judges in chapter 2, you will find a kind of summary of how these folks understood history. People sin, they go off and worship Baal. Then the judgment of God comes in form of an invasion from one of these enemies. People repent and come back to Yahweh. And so then God sends a judge. God sends a deliverer, one of these judges. And so they have peace, they have order again, and then the whole cycle begins again and again and again. So this is like a frame story or frame structure that's placed on every one of these stories. So that tells us the belief of the author and how they are presenting this era of the judges. So keep the covenant with God who delivered us. They keep coming back to this idea. All right. Now, the united monarchy. So that's the conquest and the judges. Now we move to another unit, and this is the idea of united monarchy. By that, we mean all 12 tribes are ruled by the same person. So Saul, David, and Solomon. And this is fairly easy to remember. We had 200 years for the judges. Now we have 100 years for the united monarchy. Saul, David, Solomon, 20, 40, 40. So introduction. This is the golden age for the Hebrew people. Militarily, it was a tremendous success. David will expand all the way to Egypt and to the Euphrates. Never before and never since have they had that much territory. And this is in part, I think, why they look to David as the messianic figure. The ruler for the future will be a ruler like David. It had political stability. The economy was strong. You hear about the wealth of Solomon. Sources, we have quite a bit of information here in Samuel and Kings, but you see there that there are 2 kind of streams about monarchy. Is that good or not? The argument against it is God alone should be our ruler. And of course, the argument for it is we've got to have some help against the Philistines and other people. And so but you're going to have this tension in the background constantly pulling apart, pulling against the monarchy or the central united government. Samuel's a transition figure and a religious leader. So it's called the Book of Samuel. Okay. So crisis of the Amphiktyon and the Philistines. So the Philistines start pushing out, and they're successful with their iron, their chariots, their weapons, and so forth. They defeat the Danites. They take the city of Aphek, which is a huge gain for them, and an alarm for the Israelites. They capture the ark, but they have disease break out wherever it goes. So it's sort of a curse on them at the same time. So they sort of put that aside. Now, the people choose Saul because he had a history of successful warfare. He had defeated the Ammonites, who had bothered the folks again. He was a charismatic figure, tall, powerful, and he had the approval of Samuel. His military efforts against the Philistines, they took the city of Gibeah, and that became his capital. Actually, it's just a little village, and it means a hill of beans. So you look at the pictures today, you see all these little stones look like a sack of beans. So it's not very impressive capital city. And of course, David comes along and defeats Goliath, who represents the Philistines. Jonathan, who is Saul's son and David's best friend, is successful at Michmash. But in the end, as the Philistines strike to the north and Saul goes there, he's defeated at Gilboa. His sons are all killed. He's about to be killed and asks his attendant to kill him, who refuses. And so he falls on his own sword. So the Philistines factor in a big way in the experience of Saul. All right. So Saul, as a ruler, he is at least the ruler of all 12 tribes, and he brings the priest to a central place. But there's no developed state. There's no taxes. He doesn't have a respectable harem of a number of women. He doesn't have a palace. He's a kind of like on the frontier and just trying to save the 12 tribes. So the tragedy of Saul is Samuel at first was for Saul and he anointed him. But then Samuel turned against Saul because Saul took on responsibilities, religious responsibilities of making sacrifices and so forth, which Samuel said he should not have done. Then with Saul and David, at first Saul favored David, but then Saul attempted to kill David thereafter. He became jealous of him. You know, Saul has killed his thousands, David his tens of thousands, the women sang, and that was very upsetting to him. So then his own death, he appeals to the witch of Endor. Interestingly, he had already ruled out necromancy, which means consulting the dead. But the word came to him that he would die in that battle. So does this represent apostasy, which means falling away from your faith, or is it mental instability? So people can be charitable or they can be really tough on this guy. But here he is trying to save these folks and using his whole life to defend them and wearing out against the Philistines. So the summary of Saul's rule, I would say, is he did stop the Philistines and saved Israel. And he's the first king of united Israel. All right, move on. Now, David is considered to be Israel's greatest king, and it's easy to remember. Just put him at 1,000, and this will help you orient with your chronology, sort of what came before and what comes after David. We have the sources there. His family is well documented in all of this. His personality, we're given a lot of information about this guy because we have a section of the historical books, which is called the Court Chronicle. So modern Old Testament scholars believe that a good bit of this was written by somebody who observed what went on in David's life and wrote it accordingly. So he was recognized by Saul, by Samuel, by the anointing, by Saul, by the music, and in his skills as a soldier. He also was shrewd. And so he married into the royal family, Michael, and he befriended Jonathan, which I think was a genuine friendship. But nonetheless, all that would help him politically as well. At first, he was on the run because Saul was after him. And so he and his buddies would sell protection, kind of a mafioso style. You know, they go up to a guy, a rancher, and say, "You have a lot of wonderful sheep here. It'd be terrible if something should happen to some of those, but we can guarantee it won't if you'll give us such and such." So it was kind of what we would call kind of a shady operation at that point. But then when he would raid other groups in the south, the Philistines and the Israelites were both rewarded. So if he would take booty from people he had defeated, then he would present some of that to the Philistines and some to the Israelites. So he's pretty shrewd politically, doesn't know which way this is going to pan out. And so he makes contributions to both parties. Okay. Now, as king, his army captured Jerusalem from the Jebusites. And now you have, what becomes known as the center of this religion and of Christianity, and a major center for Islam and so on. And he brought the ark here as well. His conquests included all these people we've been talking about. We showed the picture there to start with in the map. So everything in sight, basically. The organization is much more sophisticated. Now you have a military section, you have a census taken, you have taxes. Instead of blood feud, fighting one another just because somebody's killed a member of your family, now you have a kind of a justice system to try to calm people down and give them justice in courts. Okay. Now, the narrator has given us a wonderful picture of success after success after success of David in the first half. Then, with his adultery with Bathsheba and the killing of her husband Uriah, now you'll see the narrative going down, down, down. And that's just the structure, the literary structure of these passages of the Old Testament. So the problem is one of succession. So Absalom gets into all kinds of difficulty. Amnon rapes his sister Tamar, so Absalom kills him. And then Joab kills Absalom, and there's another rival, Sheba, who's killed. Adonijah makes a bid for power, but Bathsheba once supported Solomon, and Solomon gets the nod. But the poor man's suffering with his children is just endless after this event. So David's religion, however, he's called a man after God's own heart. So what's going on there? Well, he does keep covenant, and God promises him that the rulers in Jerusalem, the rulers of Israel from now on, will be his descendants. And so that happens. And then the devotion is to Yahweh. We don't hear about Baal like we did back in the time of the judges. So that's been taken care of. And then the worship has become centered at Jerusalem with the ark, with the Psalms, and with the special way in which you can hear the word from God, this garment called the ephod. But especially important now is the notion of, in the future, a future ruler will come and rule in the manner of David. And so this is the notion of a Messiah. Okay. So Solomon is the third and final ruler of the United Kingdom. So we have various sources there, and we have this guy especially keen on building. He built a palace for himself. He built fortifications with chariots scattered around to sort of protect this big land that David has conquered. Now, he doesn't have to go to war, so he inherits all that and has the benefits of peace. The most important building is Solomon's Temple. And so that will last from the time it's built, 950, down to the time that the Babylonians destroy it. That's the first temple, or Solomon's Temple. And you can see It was the center of religion for those people for a long, long time. Commercial enterprises, horses and chariots he sold to other folks. He had shipping coming out of the Ezion Geber way down to the south. The Phoenicians helped him with ships and so on. Copper mining, smelting, and so forth. People that we hear about are Hiram of Tyre and the Queen of Sheba. So those are important rulers from a distance who pay their respects to Solomon. Okay. The temple is, this is a little schema of the temple. The main thing to see, Dan, you might be able to help us here. On the far left is the Holy of Holies. There you are. So that's a little cube of 30 feet by 30 feet. And you see the ark is placed in it. Now let's move out to the holy place. And you will find there a little table for incense. So it smells good. A table for bread. So God is fed. And then all these lights around there as well. A candlestick or candelabra. So that one is 60 by 30. And again, sort of 2 squares there. Come out further, and there's a little courtyard there, entryway. And so the whole thing is about 105 feet long as a result. The other 2 really important pieces are down at the bottom. The round thing is called the brazen sea. Come on down. There we are. And that's a kind of a laver or purification. And then the center of everything is this brazen altar, this big square. There you are, where they did the sacrifices to Yahweh. Now notice that nobody goes inside this temple except the priests, and nobody goes in the Holy of Holies except the high priest once a year. So worship occurs outside. This is so different. That's just the way the Greeks did as well. You know, the Temple of Athena, the Parthenon, and you see the worship is outside. This is a big difference with Christianity, where you build buildings to come inside and express the community in that way. All right. Solomon's foreign relations with Phoenicia. The seamen were enormously helpful to him, and related to that is a little animal that produced purple dye that they, which was, really prized, and they sold that all over. They were the craftsmen who did so much to build the temple. We believe that the alphabet, or we have the best evidence for the alphabet being started there. So you have hieroglyphics and you have cuneiform, but an alphabet is what you need. The marriage treaties, this is the way Solomon kept peace. It is marry the daughters of all these people around. The wisdom tradition is that he was a wise ruler, and the very famous example of the 2 women who claimed the same baby, and a patron of writers as well. So we believe that the Yahwist, whom we recognized last time, actually was writing about 950. He's writing about, in Genesis, you have a reference to the preeminence of Judah. When did that occur? Well, with David. And the boundaries of the land go from Egypt to the Euphrates, according to Genesis 15. When did that happen? Also, according to what we've seen here, is at the time of David. So we believe that this Yahweh, this first narrative describing the heritage of the Hebrew people, was written in the time of Solomon. All right. Significance is his wealth and wisdom. Let's move on. Conclusions. Let's move on from there. Keep the covenant, rely on God, not rulers. You get the theology over and over again. All right. And so now we're going to go to the rival kingdoms, the fall of Israel and Judah. You see on the left, Saul, David, Solomon, that's the United Kingdom. Now, in about 922, you're going to have a division. Israel, now the language gets messed up here for us. If you think about Israel up here as Ephraim and Manasseh and all those to the north, but the language in the Bible can be confusing, because now we're going to talk about the 10 northern tribes. That's Israel. And then Judah is 2 tribes in the south. Now, in 200 years, the northern kingdom is going to be destroyed. And then in the south, the southern kingdom will last an extra 135 years, and it will be destroyed. And these people will be taken into captivity. And so this is where we go next. 2 kingdoms and many prophets. I'll try to move through the kingdom business quickly to get to the message of the prophets. So what is the divided kingdom? Now, the north is going to last for exactly 200 years. It's going to have 10 tribes. It's a larger territory. There are 9 dynasties. A dynasty is a family of rulers and 19 rulers, so it's not going to be very stable. You get this influence of kind of an Amphictyony, or all the tribes wanting to have their people ruling. The capital in the north is Samaria. It has produced another version of Israel's history. So we have one from Solomon from the south. What about one from the north now? So we believe the Elohist wrote at about 850 and produced yet another, because the Elohist uses the name El for God. The Yahwist uses the name Yahweh, both in the book of Genesis, starting there and moving forward. Now, so Judah will last an extra 135 years. It's only 2 tribes. That's primarily Judah, and it kind of absorbs Benjamin. And there's this one dynasty, as we said, of David with 20 kings. The capital is Jerusalem. They're only about 50 miles apart. Whereas Israel in the north is destroyed in 722 by Assyria, Judah is destroyed by Babylon, because the Babylonians will have destroyed the Assyrians. Okay, the sources are there indicated. Now, comparisons, we have strong rival tribes, Ephraim or Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Economically, the north is strongest. It has more resources. It has 10 tribes. It has lots of space. But the south has the edge in terms of Yahweh worship. It's going to be a lot more committed to the worship of Yahweh. The forms of government in the north, they prefer this loose sort of Amphictyony sort of idea, whereas in the south, you're going to have the Davidic monarchy holding things together. Now, why did this kingdom fall apart? What was the cause of division? Rehoboam is the son of Solomon, and his fiscal policy was heavy taxation and forced labor. Jeroboam was leader of the north. He was from Ephraim. And once he heard the policies of Rehoboam being stated, he was going to make it even tougher than Solomon in all of these areas. He said famously, the line is in the Old Testament, "To your tents, O Israel." That is, let's go home, Israel, and we will go our own way. So Ahijah, who is a prophet at that point, agrees and gives his blessing. And so you have a secession. The north secedes from the south, and you have now the kingdom of Israel divided, and it makes 2 kingdoms. So Rehoboam did not respond decisively. He did hold on to Judah and Benjamin. And so we have now to deal with 2 kingdoms. All right. Jeroboam's policies, a new capital at Shechem, new religious shrines. Now, he doesn't want his people going to Jerusalem to worship, to come from the northern kingdom down to the southern kingdom. So he puts up 2 new shrines to worship at Dan and Bethel. And of course, the biblical writer is horrified by that. Says, oh, these have become centers of idolatry again. With the golden bulls, modern Old Testament scholars give him a break there and say, well, these bulls were meant to be a kind of a basis for or the presence of the invisible God. But anyway, they could certainly be seen as idols, and that was the way they were interpreted. So the interpretation of the author of the Book of Kings, that Jeroboam is the man who made Israel to sin. That's the way that King James puts it. He's the arch sinner, and then all the kings after him will do the same thing. They don't remove these idols, these symbols of Baal in the northern kingdom. Okay. So the prophet Ahijah, who had supported his let's take off, condemns this as a form of idolatry. Now what you have happening is, whereas David had controlled all this huge empire, all this territory beyond Israel, now all that's lost because people see what's going on, see that they're weakened, and just reclaim their old territory. And 4 years later, there was an invasion from the Pharaoh in Egypt, and the people in Judah and the people in Israel have no power against him at all. He just goes at will and retreats without, we don't know exactly why, but probably some problems back at home. Okay. 5 major kings. Jeroboam the first. Omri is the first dynasty. He conquered Moab. The Assyrians, for the next 100 years, will refer to Israel as the land of Omri. So he must have really tore into their armies, and because he made a huge impression. And he's the guy who sets up Samaria as the permanent capital in the north. There's a lot of prosperity here. And then Ahab comes along, and he has wars with Syria and with Assyria, and is able to stop the Assyrians with the help of other folks. Okay. Ahab married Jezebel as well, and so that will be a problem for the prophets. Jehu is the fourth. He leads this revolution against the house of Omri and has support from Elisha, the Rechabites, and others. Jeroboam the second is the fifth, and one of the more important rulers here. He restored the empire, excuse me, as much as he could. That is, he reconquered some of that territory that had been lost. This is a time of great prosperity, as Amos will tell us, and of Baal worship, as Hosea will tell us. Then after Jeroboam, after 746, you have very weak rulers, and they're trying to cope with the Assyrians. But you see in 722, what is that? Only 24 years later, it's all over for the northern kingdom, because the Assyrians are going to come and take over in that year. So then we talk about the 10 lost tribes. And that's what we mean by the 10 lost tribes. From 722, you can't trace them after that. Okay. Now, the early prophets, that was a very brief overview, but in the Bible itself, the narrator will talk about the northern ruler, and then the southern ruler, and the northern ruler, and the southern ruler, and that will go back and forth. So it's a little difficult to sort out. This is a simplification of that. The early prophets, the word nabi means one who speaks for another, or in Greek, prophetes, but the idea is simply a spokesman for God. The origins come way back, and we'll look at some of those in a moment. Types of message. There is in the prophets a word of hope about a messianic future. This is one way the New Testament connects with the Old Testament, and seeing Jesus as Messiah, or Christ is the Greek name for Messiah. But most of what they had to say was very immediate. This is a problem we are facing in our society. We need to do such and such now and get this fixed, or else. So problems addressed: political and economic corruption. Amos is all over that. Personal immorality of people. That's why Nathan called David to court. Religious syncretism, failure to worship and love God, Elijah, Hosea, and so on. All right. Types of prophets. There are a few in the Old Testament who are seers, who look for future events. There are also the ecstatic prophets. Ecstasy means literally to stand outside yourself, or to be in a trance. You're occupied by a spirit, and that speaks for you. And the Canaanites, as you remember, their prophets, as they challenged Elijah, went in that direction. And then what we have in the Old Testament, preaching prophets, or prophets who declare the will of God under the covenant, what we should be doing. Prophets and priests, there's some tension, but there's also support, because they're both promoting the covenant, the worship of God. True and false prophets. How do you figure out whether or not a preacher or a person who claims to be a person who is called by God is? Well, you look at the moral life. Do the words match the person's life? Does this prophet support the things that you find in the Old Testament prophets? Justice, fairness, to other people? What about the interior witness? Is this person called by God? Of course, the person will say so, but and only that person will know. And then another final, but much later sort of confirmation is, were these words accepted into the body of Scripture? Were they canonized? So those are some of the, but you do have the problem of a false prophet that shows up in the Old Testament. Okay. Early prophets, Nathan, as we say, rebuked David. Ahijah has approved Jeroboam and then condemned him. So, his message can change according to how a person behaves. Micaiah says, Ahab, you go to war and you will die. And Ahab says, well, let me call in my 450 paid prophets. And they all said, no, you won't. And Micaiah said, no, you won't. He said, that's not what you've been saying. So Micaiah said, you will die if you go out. And of course, the battle was over, but Ahab was hit by an arrow as he retreated and he died. So this is the idea of one legitimate, honest truth speaker speaking truth to power. And this is the importance of Micaiah at the time of Ahab. Elijah is really the prototype of all the prophets. The criterion of a prophet comes through right here. If you want the message of the Old Testament, then look to two things: faithfulness to Yahweh and fairness to other people. That's it. You look at the 10 Commandments: faithfulness to Yahweh, fairness to other people. You look to Jesus when they said, well, make it simple, summarize for us, which is the great law? And this is what he said. He gave exactly the same summary. It's a relationship, a right relationship to God and a right relationship to other people. So the problem that he faced here is the Baalism of Jezebel. She came from Phoenicia, where they worshiped this Canaanite Baal. And he says, how long will you people go limping between worshiping Yahweh, worshiping Baal, worshiping Yahweh? Make up your mind. And of course, you remember the very dramatic calling on God to witness the truth. And then Jezebel was after him. And so he became a great long distance runner and ran all the way, we're told, to Horeb, which is Mount Sinai, another name for Mount Sinai. And there received just reassurance from God in his melancholy, in his despair and depression. Then he returns and talks about Naboth's vineyard. This is a very good example of what the prophets were about. So Ahab, you have all of this property, and yet you want this vineyard that is very productive, that's very close to you, and you can't buy it. And so you're going to take it in an unjust way. And so, he plants people to lie about what Naboth has done and so forth, and confiscates this property. And so Elijah confronts Ahab and tells him that he has sinned. He has committed wrong. Ahab recognizes that, but it's too late. The damage is already done. So Elisha is his successor, who is very much interested in humanitarian interests, healing Naaman the leper, caring for the Shunammite woman's son, and bringing life to her, and so on. All right, so those are early prophets. Mount Carmel, this is the site of Elijah's contest with the prophets of Baal. This is the site in Israel. And so it's seen as a place of contesting true religion and false religion. All right. This is why the Branch Davidians called their home Mount Carmel. So it's located, you can see the location just outside of Waco here. Originally, it was in Waco, just to the far side. There's a little lake over there. Further over, Dan, all the way over. No, keep going to the left. Right there, that little bit of blue just by Waco. There it is, Lake Waco. They used to be right there, and you could look over there like Mount Carmel into this lake region. So again, the whole idea is a point where you have true religion and and false religion competing with one another. All right, let's move on. Prophetic books. Now, these are called writing prophets. They didn't write, but they have their material written down by other people for them, their sermons and so forth. Now, today we're focusing on the book of the prophets. And for the Jewish faith, the Hebrew Bible has first part is the law or the Torah. The second part is prophetic books. And it looks like this. There are 8 books in the prophetic section. The former books are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. That's 4 books, and they don't divide Kings and Samuel. And then the latter are what we call those books of history. And we call the rest the books of prophets. But it's a larger category for them when you say the book of the prophets. The latter prophets are 4. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel are all very long. They take a scroll each. And then you could put these really little short prophets on 12 of them on one scroll. That's why they're called minor prophets. That's deceptive because their message is just as important and just as powerful as the long-winded prophets. Now, prophetic literature lasts for about 400 years. And the prophetic literature that we have in our Bible is recognized as scripture by about 200 BC. By then, you see people in the Hebrew community saying, according to the law and the prophets, according to the law and the prophets, over and over and over again. That will be the way they will refer to their scripture. Sermons, brief bios, the purpose is to elicit a response to the covenant. Amos and Hosea are called the greatest of the minor prophets with the timeless message. Move on. Amos, judgment. His life is in the time of Jeroboam, where there's a lot of prosperity, and he is told to go and prophesy to Jeroboam and to the north. His message is a message of judgment, a judgment against all the nations. And he says, God is going to judge the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Philistines, everybody. And people, he got them on track with them. And then he turned on Israel and said, but above all, God is going to judge Israel. And the day of Yahweh, that used to be the day of celebration, the day when you would have carnival, the day when you'd have parades, because it's going to be the triumph of Yahweh. Well, let me tell you, he says, the day of Yahweh is going to be the day when you are destroyed. The day of judgment is coming on you people. Now remember, at 750, we're only one generation away from destruction at 722. It's upon them, and he's telling them the truth. So this is a key idea. The prophets reverse this idea of day of Yahweh of being a big privilege for us as, hey, we have a responsibility or we're going to be paying for it. So he has these visions of doom. It's like a locust plague or a supernatural fire, like a drought, coming supernatural underground fire, or a plumb line, which a carpenter uses to measure things and to get it accurate. Well, our plumb is leaning and we're going to fall down soon. We're like a basket of summer fruit. This is a word play because fruit and end of time or something, end of an era, sounds very much alike. So you like rotting fruit, city, you've left it there too long. And Yahweh actually is going to destroy the temple. They thought as long as the temple stood, they were safe. Nobody could knock that over. So these guys are pretty radical in their messages. Okay, let's go on. So the reasons for injustice, well, you merchants are so greedy and you just oppress the poor. You don't pay any attention to them. The women they're just, women, the wives of these merchants and so on. The lawyers, they're corrupt. The courts are corrupt. The religious leaders, they don't have any integrity enough to speak out against injustice. Your worship is you attach everything to sacrifice. You are, in this famous phrase, at ease in Zion. You're just so comfortable with your religion. It makes no demands on you. You have gotten to a position where your religion doesn't challenge you at all. It is simply that you have made peace with and you sort of put it aside. So he calls for repentance from injustice. Sorry, a little typo there. Here's the summary of this book. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. This is a very good example of Hebrew parallelism. He's saying the same thing in two lines. Let justice, which is the same as righteousness, roll down like waters, which is the flowing stream. So he's just saying, look, what God is all that he's asking for you is that you create a society which is just, which is fair. So that's his message. And this was repeated over and over by Martin Luther King Jr. Hosea is the message is one of love, of steadfast love, of mercy. He's also in the north. His imagery is based on family relationships. His wife's name was Gomer, but she was unfaithful to him. And so the children are named Jezreel, where Jehu overthrew Jeroboam. Lo Ruhamah, not pitied. Lo Ami, does that mean that this child is a bastard child? Your father and son image is used when Israel was a child. I loved her. You remember how much energy you poured into your children and would hope for them to love you back in your older age. The wife, that it was so painful for him to lose this woman. And so he begins to understand the pain of Yahweh as this chosen people have left him. They go whoring after other gods. They worship other gods. So the summary of the book of Hosea is, for I desire steadfast love. I don't care about sacrifice. I don't care about all those externals that you do. The knowledge of God, that's the same thing as steadfast love, rather than burnt offerings. So this is the key term. One of the key terms of the Old Testament is hesed, which is steadfast love. That's what God has for us. And ours wavers, and we need to be reminded of that and to come back to it. Rowan Williams, the Archbishop was the Archbishop of the Anglican Church in England, is a wonderful theologian. And he has a book in which he uses the term tokens of God's care and God's love. So actually, if you take these last two that we've talked about, Amos is really interested in the justice, and Hosea is really interested in the love of God. So for people and for God, again, the prophets are summarizing those essentials. All right, we're getting near the end. Judah, before the fall of the north, there are significant prophets here. We'll move on. Well, let me show you the map. You see Judah here. The blue is all gone now. That's the 10 northern tribes. The Assyrians have wiped them out. Okay. Well, before the fall, sorry, that's still there. But after 722, that's what's gone. Okay, next one. Judah alone, we have Hezekiah ruling. At this point in time, there's the Assyrian threat. He does a marvelous job with water supply. It's quite amazing the things that they were able to accomplish to sort of protect themselves. Hezekiah is reckoned by the writer to be one of the really good kings of Judah. Let's move on. So one of the things he did, you think of your house and a fence around all your property, and there is a spring of water outside to the back, and you've been relying on that. So what you do is you cover that over and redirect that spring underwater through pipe so that it comes up in your property. That's essentially what he did with the spring of Gihon, to bring the water into Jerusalem, where it's walled in, where people have access to the pure water, and it flows into the pool of Siloam. So this is quite an engineering feat. It's about a third of a mile, and some of it's 100 feet underground. You can walk through most of it, and it's just quite a remarkable thing. But he knew the Assyrians were coming, And so he had time to strengthen the walls, and they just barely survived in 701, or it would have been all over for them, just as it was for the northern kingdom. Okay. Sennacherib writes about his conquest. At Hezekiah, I made him like a bird in a cage. I conquered 46 cities around him, but he didn't conquer Jerusalem. So we get to have another 135 years of rule and of independence in the south. Okay. Judah alone. Manasseh is the worst ruler they ever had. The Syrian deities come back in. Josiah is considered the best because the book of Deuteronomy was discovered there, and the prophetess Huldah said, "This is of God. We should follow that." And so religious reform occurs there. Okay. Collapse of Judah. We will just say that the Babylonians are in power and have taken over all of that region, and they take over Jerusalem as a result. Okay, move on. Short prophetic books. I'm sorry, our time is gone. If I could have another 5 minutes or so. Zephaniah says, you guys are not worshiping God. You're just ignoring him. So this is kind of a practical atheism. You don't have to say, I don't believe in God. You just kind of ignore religion, ignore your faith. So there's a warning about that. Nahum is so delighted with the destruction of Nineveh, which was the capital of Assyria. And that's what that whole book is about. And it's a way of saying, look, God finally gave justice to those old bullies. And then Habakkuk says, wait a minute, God, at least some of us are trying to follow you. Why are you letting these pagan powers overwhelm us? And the message that finally came to him is, you got to trust me. You got to believe in me. And Paul will pick that up in Romans 1. Just shall live by faith. Okay.
Bill, I kind of held this up about 15 minutes at the beginning, so feel free to go on.
Okay. All right. Good. So prophets in Judah, Isaiah 1 through 39, about 701 BCE. So the background is the Assyrian crisis and in the north, and they're worried about that in the south as well. So he has 5 major ideas that we can easily identify. One is the notion of God's holiness, the vision of God. And a lot of us will sing, holy, holy, holy. This is where this comes from. So he is in the temple. This is the time of his call, and he recognizes his own unholiness. I'm unclean. And so the seraphim are figures that are there to praise God, and they sing holy, holy, holy. They bring from the altar a firebrand and touch his lips as a way of symbolizing the purification that will go on as he does his speaking and so on. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up. And so you get this notion of this powerful God. The second is faith as trust in God. And he keeps saying, look, do not trust foreign alliances. They had done this in the past. They made an alliance with the Egyptians, and then the Egyptians didn't honor it. And then they made an alliance with somebody else, and they didn't have the strength to face or to deflect the power of the Babylonians. So again, faith as he's not saying don't be realistic, but he's saying keep your trust in God. That's your primary commitment. And then God's judgment comes, and here's an odd thing. If you're trying to follow God's will and you are suffering nonetheless, then how do you interpret that? And why should the Assyrians not be the ones destroyed? That's what Nahum was all about. He was not only about justice, he felt revenge in his heart. So what he has to say in a newer insight is, look, God is using this powerful empire as a rod to punish us, to bring us around to where we need to be. So again, he's not giving up on God. He's not saying the Assyrian gods must be the true gods because they won the battle. You see, so he has to figure out some way to make sense of all of this. So the Assyrians, the Babylonians are used as a rod to punish Israel and Judah. The upcoming Davidic king is the Messiah. He will become a rod out of the stem of Jesse. So Jesse is the father of David. So the line, the messianic line, goes from David and forward. Now, there's another really important new idea that emerges here, and that is that God's people are a new people, and a remnant concept revises the notion of elect nation. So now he's given up on the whole idea that all of the Hebrew people, all the Israelites, are elect. They're not. 10 of the tribes have been gone, have been destroyed. So how are we going to cope with that? Well, instead of it being a whole chosen nation, it's certain ones within the nation who do keep the covenant. So the notion of a remnant has been very, very powerful all through church history. You know, a minority, but nonetheless trying to be faithful and true and so forth. So there are some really valuable, powerful kinds of ideas in our understanding of God and ourselves and our relationship to God that come out of Isaiah. And you find Isaiah read extensively from the Old Testament for Christian worship. Okay. Micah is the other prophet. Now there are 4 8th century prophets. The first 2 were speaking to the folks in Israel, in the north. And these last 2 are speaking to the people in Judah in the south. So Micah's message is one of judgment. Zion shall be plowed as a field. Zion is a poetic term for the mount in Zion, mount in Jerusalem, where the temple is located. So it will be plowed as a field. That is, Jerusalem will be destroyed. The temple will be destroyed. Peace. He does have the vision of peace. This wonderful line, they'll beat their swords into plowshares. This statement is also found in Isaiah. So there's this real hope, despite the fact that doom seems to be impending. And then the best summary of all the prophetic message is right here. This would be a great one to memorize if you're interested in getting key Bible verses. He has told you, O man, what is good and what does the Lord require of you? But to, here it is, do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with your God. So do justice, that's Amos. Love kindness, that's Hosea. Walk humbly with your God, that's Isaiah. So this is just a wonderful place to go as a summary of the message of the prophets. Okay. Jeremiah comes along. Next, he has this inner compulsion that, I didn't want to be a prophet, but it's burned in my bones. I've got to speak out. So he complains to God a lot. He has a scribe by the name of Baruch who writes out all of his stuff. And one of the kings, Josiah supported the reform, but then Jehoiakim, when he saw these proposals from Jeremiah, he took his penknife and he sliced it all up, and then he put it on a fire. So Baruch had to go back and redo the whole thing. This is a clue as to how we got the prophetic sermons or messages. It may well be that others had followers like this, or a little band of followers who went with them and who kept their sermons together and passed those along so that finally in 200 BCE, they are accepted as scripture. Jerusalem falls to Babylonia in 587. And he ended the book in chapter 52 by lifting out what you have in 2 Kings 24:25. It's the same. Okay. Jeremiah's thought, first to destroy and overthrow. This guy's in a real pickle because he spans the time of the fall of Jerusalem. The covenant's been broken. You folks are stubborn as you can be. Can a leopard change its spots? No. Will you likely change? No, you're too stubborn to do so. The temple sermon really got their attention. The temple is going to be destroyed, folks. Hate to tell you, you are relying on that, but for your preservation as a nation. And then he gives signs of impending doom. The most graphic, I suppose, is a cauldron up at Phoenicia poured out from the north that covers all of the land, a cauldron of hot water that just, in other words, a military marching through and destroying everything in its path. Restoration. But folks, God's still with us. Repent simply is the image of walking along one way, stopping, turning around, and going the opposite way. You need to come back to God. He has the notion of the remnant as well. Obviously, the prophets now are going to pick up with that regularly. Messiah still gives us hope. There's going to be a new covenant, and this is new with Jeremiah. The covenant is not just saying things in a covenant renewal ceremony. The covenant comes from the heart. You have to have it in your heart and change your heart. And that's where you get the notion of the love of God implanted permanently. And so he purchased some land near Jerusalem with the idea that when all this is over, I'm going to be able to go back there and resume my land. So you keep confidence as well. God is the potter and we're the clay. Okay. Next. Vineyard of the Near East. Looks so wonderful. And divine dressers. This is, again, very much in the prophetic language. Okay. Questions, comments?
Bill, I would encourage of you to unmute your system if you want to ask some questions. And I have one, Bill. Can you give me a sense? I'm sure it varies, but who wrote most of this stuff? I guess the many of the prophets had scribes, but do we know how all this was it written during the time it happened, or did they look back on it, or what?
That's a big puzzle. What we think is that there are sources, a lot of them, that were carried forward and then were finally put in their final form with people who had access to all these histories and sources, collections, and so forth, especially in the period of the exile, which is coming up next, as they go into exile and feel like they need to preserve this, and also the time just after they return to Israel. But yeah, it's a good question because we don't have anything definite. You just have to sort of use what evidence you have and try to reconstruct the time of this. But in terms of names of people, those names get attached to people, but all of those are in question. Like, you know, David in the Psalms, because we know a lot of the Psalms were written after he was dead, and Solomon and the Song of Songs and so forth. We'll talk about those some next time, but that's I'm not trying to evade, but it is
that's a difficult.
It's not a very simple thing where you can say X wrote this, right? Anybody else?
Other questions? All right.
Next time we will do period of the exile, and so they have to go off to Babylonia, the leaders, and then the Persians are very nice, and so they say you can go home if you want. So the restoration, many of them will return. They'll pull together all their wisdom literature then, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the book of Psalms, and so on. So this is what we oftentimes call between the testaments, and what's happening at the end of the Old Testament and into the time of the New Testament. So the Apocrypha is written at this point in time as well. And as we said, Dan had asked earlier about this. So the canonization, or simply recognizing which books are actually going to be authoritative and be scripture for us. So Jesus will say during his time, according to the law and the prophets. So clearly, the Torah, the first section, and the prophets, the second section, what he was reading when he took a scroll out in the synagogue and then commented on it in his lifetime. Anything? Yeah. Any question?
Any questions?
I have one question. Do
Yeah.
the Hebrew scholars agree with all of this?
They there's a pretty good effort on the part of Hebrew scholars and Christian scholars at the academic level. American Academy of Religion has a lot of presentations by Hebrew scholars and so forth. So they do try to learn from one another, to be sure. But of course, the big difference is Christian scholars are looking toward a New Testament as well, and toward what this is going to mean for Jesus and for the church to follow. And that kind of appropriation from the standpoint of the worldview of a Jewish scholar today, obviously is in error. So, but I think in terms of what happened, what does the archaeology show? You know, those kinds of things, you get really good reviews back and forth. I'm just reading a book by the guy who edited the major book on archaeology, major journal on archaeology, and he's Jewish, and many of the contributors are as well, because they're right there, and they're working on those tells or mounds all the time. Good question. Anybody else?
If you've got any books that reveal this archaeology, because I've been to Israel, I've seen some of the tells, and I know they're working on them. But if you could recommend those in the end, that would be nice.
Okay, we'll be glad to pull some of that together.
Thank you.
You bet.
Any other questions? Well, Bill,
Lunchtime.
yeah, thank you so much for
your patience, folks.
Yes, and we'll have all this archived, and we'll meet again in a month and continue this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.